Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 36, Swordsman of the Mist 6. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 6. While Kakashi and Itachi were fortunate enough that Zabuza wasn't all that far away from the city, meaning they wouldn't need to run for too long to reach him, even the half an hour they ultimately required at their top speed was much more than either of them was comfortable with. What wasn't quite so fortunate, on the other hand, was that they encountered one little problem just before they were about to actually reach their destination. It happened while they were running through the woods, just when they could feel the trembling ground that must be the result of a nearby explosion. Thick mist started to roll towards them, encasing them from all sides. It wasn't an unexpected occurrence, quite the opposite, but it was still rather annoying. It seems they want to keep us separated just like last time. Kakashi, who had come to a stop beside him, nodded. Obviously. He then pushed his forward protector up to reveal his blazing Sharingan to match Itachi's already activated ones. I hate it to play right into their hands, but I'm afraid we don't have much of a choice about this. He was unfortunately right. In all likelihood, the one who had created the mist was just another water clone that was sent to slow them down while the originals took care of Zabuza. Itachi and Kakashi wouldn't be able to pass here without a fight, but they also couldn't afford it to leave their third teammate on his own for much longer. It was a fair guess to say that the previous explosion was a result of Zabuza's fight, meaning he was still alive, but he would have been forced to fight on his own against two enemies for a while now. He was in much more danger than either Itachi or Kakashi, so one of them would need to take care of the clone to allow the other to pass. Do you dash? You go, Kakashi interrupted him. You're faster than I am and Zabuza probably needs help as soon as possible. I have thought of a way to deal with this bothersome technique, so I will join you soon. Even if Itachi had thought of arguing the point instead of just accepting it, the shuriken flying towards them would have forced them to put an end to it. Without any further hesitation, Itachi jumped aside to dodge the attack before continuing to run in the direction his crow had been leading them. Zabuza didn't know exactly how long he ran through the underground complex, avoiding traps and collapsing ceilings as good as he could while growing angrier by the minute, but fact was that his patience had run out quite a while ago. I came here to fight, not to run through empty corridors. He finally reached his boiling point when he outran yet another attempt at having him buried alive by breaking through a wooden door to escape into the room behind it. Kushimaru, he yelled. Jinin. I know you bastards can hear me. Stop hiding and face me. It was one thing for them to use the hiding in mist technique against him, but this? Trying to kill him by having the ceiling collapse on top of him? That was just insulting. At least the former actually required the user to kill their opponents themselves by using one's skill, but cowardly traps like this were just plain beneath him. It wasn't that didn't understand that Shinobi fought dirty wherever possible. If he were in a position where he could kill his enemies without even getting close to them, he would use it without hesitation as well. However, this wasn't just a fight between random opponents but between swordsmen of the mist. If they were to kill each other, then they would do so with their very own hands. Everything else wouldn't be satisfying. Zabuza knew that his former comrades thought the same, so it made no sense for them to act like this. As if to confirm these thoughts, slow steps could be heard through the room that Zabuza only now realized was an arena. You actually dare to face me for real? Color me surprised. Forgive me, my old friend, Jinin said with a nasty smirk on his face. I merely wanted to make sure that we wouldn't be disturbed during our fight before we start, and what better way to do so than to destroy every single path that leads to us. So you didn't forget how to speak after all, Zabuza scoffed as he jumped from the gallery he had found himself in into the arena itself. Say, what would you have done if you actually killed me with that little trick of yours? I don't usually talk with my opponents through one of my clones, Jinin said, realizing that Zabuza was referring to their confrontation a few days ago. That's just so impersonal, don't you think so too? And regarding your second question, well, I guess then you wouldn't have been worth my time to begin with. Seriously, which good shinobi is crushed by some rocks in a cave? He didn't dignify that with a reply. Instead, he looked around the arena. It has been a while since we were together, hasn't it? He said. Where is Kushimaru? I don't think he would be happy to miss this little reunion out. Jinan snorted. He was much more interested in your new friends and didn't put much of a fight when I told him I would take care of you on my own. I think he said he wanted to play a bit with that Uchiha brat before finally doing him in. He then shrugged as if to say, what can you do? You know how he gets when Kekkei Genkai are involved. Zabuza narrowed his eyes in disbelief. These two have no way to know that I have found you, and they will not start to miss me for several hours yet. And even when they do start to miss me, they will still need to actually find us. Are you seriously trying to tell me that Kushimaru plans to sit this out for, what? Perching in a tree for the rest of the day and hope that they somehow find me. Don't act stupid, Zabuza. We know about that crow that has been following both you and the copy ninja whenever you left the capital, and that Uchiha brat is famous for using these birds. Do you think we can't put one and one together? We let the bird live and return to its master, so your two new friends will surely arrive here soon. Well, he said slowly while hiding just how annoyed he was at them knowing about this little security measure his team had taken. I guess I should give you guys a little bit more credit. You might be stupid, but there must be a brain somewhere hidden in these thick heads of yours considering you managed to survive for this long. Rather than offended, Jinan only looked amused. I went through all the troubles to not only make this an actual one-against-one battle but also arrange such a nice place for you to die, and yet you still insult me. It seems your manners haven't improved at all since the last time we saw each other. Since when did you care about manners? And besides, how can I not insult you when you should know better than this? Know better than what exactly? Isn't that obvious? Zabuza said with a wide grin while grabbing Kubikari Bisho's hilt. You should have known better than to challenge me alone and expect to live. With that exclamation, he attacked. Kakashi blocked the shuriken that flew at Ataka's back as he continued forwards with some kunao of his own while simultaneously jumping towards where the projectiles were coming from. Unlike last time, however, Kushimaru wasn't giving his location away that easily, and what Kakashi found wasn't the man himself but merely a shuriken launcher. A second after he found it, more shuriken flew at him that were probably fired by similar apparatus. He continued to dodge these attacks for several minutes with a calm mind while trying to do what Ataki had told him was his plan during his last confrontation with this man and stay on the move. As long as Kakashi didn't stay in one place for too long and didn't let Kushimaru dictate the direction he ran in, his opponent wouldn't be able to use any of his bothersome traps. However, for some reason, the attacks stayed relatively harmless. Even in this thick mist, it wasn't hard to dodge shuriken and kunao as long as there were only small numbers of them flying at you at once, and as Kushimaru took his time to attack him after each failed attempt, Kakashi hadn't even started to sweat yet. There must be a reason for this, he thought. What is he waiting for? His question was answered a moment later when he felt murderous intent directed at him from behind, the opposite direction from which the last shuriken had come from. Kakashi swirled around just in time to block the legendary sword Nuiberi that was just about to pierce his abdomen. Kushimaru and he was surprised that the man actually attacked him frontal instead of continuing to hide in the mist didn't let up and continued to attack him. He ducked beneath the attack to his head and slashed his kunao towards his opponent's torso. Kushimaru dodged it by a hair and sent Kakashi flying with a kick before jumping after him, trying to pierce his heart and almost succeeded hadn't Kakashi been able to redirect the attack upwards just in time to save himself. Feinting to fall further back, Kakashi then surprised Kushimaru by actually jumping straight at him at the last possible moment. Nuiberi, being formed like a needle, could only truly injure an opponent by piercing them, so as soon as Kakashi was within Kushimaru's guard, the weapon became mostly useless. However, the man was not only aware of this weakness but also an experienced shinobi, so he managed to grab Kakashi's right wrist before the kunao in it could hurt him with his free hand. Just as Kakashi had expected. Instead of pushing onward with his attack, he backed away again while simultaneously pulling a small vial with yellowish liquid inside of it from one of his pockets. A second later, Kakashi escaped once again outside of Kushimaru's reach, the vial in his hand empty now and its contents smeared over Nuiberi. To no one's surprise, its wielder was once again hiding himself in the mist. Did he really think I would lower my guard enough after a few moments of harmless attacks for such a weak surprise attack to actually work? Kakashi understood that his opponent was in all likelihood only a clone that was sent to buy the original more time and to keep Kakashi's team separated, but this offense had been much weaker than the one during their last confrontation. Well, I guess this clone does have much less chakra than the last one, so it must be more frugal with it. However, in the end, it hardly mattered. If anything, his opponent being more limited in its options was a good thing for him. The only thing that truly mattered was that he had successfully managed to complete the first step of his plan. Kakashi ignored the shuriken flying towards him from his left in favor of turning around and jumping into a seemingly random direction. A second later, he found himself standing on a tree branch in front of a surprised Kushimaru. The clone could just so dodge the kunai to its throat but was unable to do anything against the kick against his chest that sent it flying away. Kakashi didn't bother to follow behind him, though. He could find his opponent with ease now anyway, so keeping track of his location with his other senses was unnecessary. No, all he wanted were a few seconds in which his opponent wasn't watching him. Caught off guard by his attack as he was, Kushimaru should be distracted enough right now to give Kakashi just that. Jumping from the tree branch, he went through the necessary hand seals during the short duration of the fall and slammed his hand on the ground as soon as he landed. Kuki-Yos no Jutsu. Summoning technique. There was no visible sign that the technique had succeeded, but he knew it did. He didn't stay where he was for long. His hands had barely touched the ground before he was already on the move again, hurrying westwards towards where he knew his opponent to be. True enough, he found Kushimaru hiding behind a bush. Not giving him any time to react, he instantly went for an attack, for the first time actually pushing his opponent rather than being pressured himself. Their limbs crashed against each other, the metallic ring of connecting weapons filled the area, and attacks missed their targets by mere millimeters while Kakashi was steadily pushing his opponent backwards and gaining more and more control over the fight. Kushimaru's movements became more hectic as the fight went on, and with every passing second, his defense continued to crumble. Then, Kakashi suddenly stopped. What dash? It was a testament to its surprise that the water clone actually spoke when it had remained silent all the time until now, but it never got the chance to finish the sentence because it was at that moment that the ground around his feet broke open, revealing a pack of dogs that fell upon the swordsman and tore him apart. The clone dissolved shortly after. Kakashi remained on guard for several more seconds, but when not only the mist began to disperse but also no new attacks were sent his way, he slowly calmed down. Good job, buds, he said to the dogs that now sat in front of him with satisfied expressions on their faces. Seems like our plan worked out just like we hoped it would. While Kakashi wasn't an Inuzuka, the fact that he used ninja dogs just like they did meant that there were some of their techniques he could use even without being trained in them. Dynamic marking, being the rather simple but effective trick it was one of them. Kushimaru might have had the foresight to eliminate his smell before facing him, but by using some urine from one of his dogs to mark Nuiberi with it, both he and his pack could track the weapon and consequently its wielder with ease wherever he went. It was a shame that he needed to use this technique against a clone instead of the original, but there was no time to lose. At least the odds were that there hadn't been anyone watching the fight this time, meaning his tactic should still be a surprise if he encountered the real Kushimaru later on. Alright, Kakashi continued. Why don't you guys dash? His eyes widened when he unexpectedly felt the flare of a chakra signature near him, but there was nothing he could do to stop the new figure that appeared in front of him and sliced him open from his navel to his shoulder with a single arc of their sword. Itaka could hear the clash of weapons when the fight behind him began, but he didn't turn around. He trusted that Kakashi would take care of his opponent and join him soon, and he had his own job to do anyway. It took less than 5 minutes to reach the location. A small elevation on an open plain not too far away from the woods he came from his crow was leading him to. At first glance, there was nothing special about the place, but once he got closer, Itaki realized that the spot where his summon was waiting for him was a little bit different. Was here an entrance that has collapsed? The crow gave an affirmative croak, confirming his theory. He couldn't be completely sure, but Itaka would bet that Zabuza had for some reason decided to enter the cave when he suspected their targets to be here instead of first returning to get him and Kakashi and then triggered a trap that collapsed the entrance. That thought made Itaka sigh. While that was definitely in character for the swordsman, he couldn't help but feel a bit annoyed about such reckless behavior. Well, nothing he could do about that now. It was much more important to get to him than it was to think about what was and what could have been. Doton, Dokusenko. Earth release, subterranean voyage. While the entrance had obviously been destroyed, the fact that Zabuza was still alive when he had evidently not been able to escape outside after triggering the trap meant that there must be some kind of underground complex. Thus, all Itaka needed to do to follow his teammate was to swim through the rubble that blocked his way. Itaka needed a few minutes of searching around until he finally found a corridor. Being able to travel through solid rock might be a useful ability, but it had the disadvantage that the only way its users could orientate themselves was through the semantic forces of their opponents. Without that, they were basically blind while in the underground, so as long as there was no one walking through the aforementioned pathway, there was no way for Itaka to be aware of its location. His only choice was to randomly travel through the earth until he found something. However, his problems unfortunately didn't stop there. Barely 5 minutes after he had found the corridor, Itaka reached a crossroad with 3 different paths he could take. With no sign of which of these paths Zabuza might have taken if he had even been here at all, Itaka decided to create 2 crow clones to cover all 3 of them. He had no idea how long he ran, but he quickly realized that finding Zabuza would be even harder than he had anticipated. Not only was the entire complex absolutely gigantic with new doors and corridors constantly popping up, but there were a lot of recently collapsed ones as well. Itaka had taken that as a good sign at first, but it became soon apparent that many of the collapsed paths were only collateral damage from the few ones that were actually intended to be destroyed, meaning they did not help him find his missing teammate at all. Furthermore, although the subterranean voyage technique wasn't very chakra expensive, using it constantly every time he found a collapsed path would drain his reserves slowly but surely, and he couldn't let that happen. Consequently, all he could do was to search for the slightest signs of Zabuza passing by while stretching his senses in hope of feeling the swordsman's chakra in the distance. It would be really helpful if there could be another explosion like the one he and Kakashi had heard before they had been separated, but alas, he had no such luck. Itaka's thoughts came to an abrupt halt when he entered a room that looked like a horror version of an operating theater. The walls were lined with glass jars containing everything from body parts to dead animals. The floor was covered with dried blood and vomit. The operating table in the center of the room had straps which were obviously designed to immobilize the patient, and the counter next to it held countless tools that looked more suitable for torture than for healing. Misery and pain were thick in the air and had burned themselves into the room's very walls. Even a blind person who had no idea what was in there would instantly know that something terrible had happened in it and that it had happened for a long time. The sight gave him a very bad feeling, and a theory began to form in his mind. For a moment, he considered whether he should go back and try another path. There were no traces that Zabuza had come through here, so he had no reason to continue this way. However, it wasn't like he had a better lead right now, so whether he went back and tried another turn or walked through this room and continued through the door he could at its other end didn't really matter. Deciding that there wasn't a good reason to backtrack when he could just as well continue onwards, he ultimately chose the latter option. To Itaka's silent relief, on the other side of that door wasn't anything gruesome to be seen. Just another corridor with even more doors on each side. With how it was connected to that operation theater, he had expected the worst. However, 3 things stood out. First, the doors here weren't the same wooden constructs he had seen in the rest of the complex so far but strong, heavy-looking metal frames. Second, this was the first corridor that showed signs of destruction without actually having collapsed completely, in that it missed nearly a third of the wall on the right side while debris piled up on the floor in front of the hole. Third, there was a strange sensation in the air. It almost felt like chakra, but not quite. It was also somewhat familiar, though Itaka couldn't place where he had felt it before. The only thing he knew for sure was that there was something sinister to it, something dark, and that he had to be wary of it. That conclusion was confirmed a second later when a figure slowly crawled out of the hole in the wall. Chapter 37, Swordsman of the Mist 7. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 7. Kakashi crouched heavily, breathing with one knee on the ground as he studied the new person that had appeared in front of him, ignoring the pain in his chest and the uncomfortable feeling of having hot blood running down his chest. The woman had black eyes and long, red hair that, together with a kiri forehead protector, was tied at both sides by a piece of cloth in such a way that both ends of the material protrude upwards while the remainder of the hair was allowed to flow downwards. She also wore a loose, pinstriped long-sleeved shirt with a dark kobe around the waist, black pants which got much looser near the ends similar to a hakama, and striped leg warmers. Most striking, however, were the two slender, double-edged swords in her hands, both of which had an upward curving prong near the tip of one side of the blade and another near the base of the other side of it. He knew who this kunoichi was. "You're the lightning blade, Amairi Ringo," he said with a croaking voice. "Wielder of the legendary twin swords Kiba." Ringo laughed, sounding genuinely delighted. "Oh? The copy ninja, Kakashi Hatake, knows my name? I'm honored." The grin on her face became even wider, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth that seemed to be a trademark of the 7 swordsmen. "And impressed as well. I really thought I got you with my attack, and yet you survived. I remember reading about your death in a report several years ago," he said, ignoring the latter part of her reply. "There weren't any rumors of your survival ever since, or I would have heard of them. Would you mind explaining to me how you're still alive? Is that truly so hard to understand? I mean, all I need to do to stay hidden is to not leave any survivors behind, right?" She then chuckled. "It's quite funny how many of my kills were credited to Kushimaru and Jinin, actually. They don't even use lightning techniques. Seriously, don't you guys do your homework?" Kakashi remembered reading the reports of the various incidents their 2 targets were accused of and discarding the mentions of people being killed by what was thought to be lightning strikes. After all, just because it wasn't their natural affinity didn't mean that they couldn't have mastered such attacks. It was actually normal for Jonin to do so. Now he wished he hadn't been that dismissive. He also suddenly realized that the Taki corpse he had found a few days ago had spotted burn marks that couldn't have come from a fire technique, suggesting the woman in front of him had been responsible for that as well. Maybe the reason Kushimaru and Jinin were so overzealous about fighting us was at least partly to stop us from spotting her. "I have heard a lot of stories about you," Ringo said. "A prodigy who has copied over 1,000 jutsu. I hope you can live up to your fame. It would be so boring if you died too easily." She raised both her swords over her head. "Raito Jutsu, Rakurai. Thunder Swords Technique, Thunderbolt." Kakashi, who had already prepared himself to dodge an attack, frowned in confusion when the lightning that shot from her weapons didn't fly towards him but the open sky. However, his confusion quickly passed and transformed into horror when he saw the energy spread out before coming back down much stronger and in much greater number than the lightning that had originally flown upwards. Ignoring the pain in his chest, Kakashi jumped back and forth to avoid the lightning bolts, thankful that such artificially created lightning was much slower than natural one. That would have been impossible to dodge. Unfortunately, evading these lightning bolts distracted him enough to almost allow Ringo to catch him by surprise again. He tilted his head away, barely dodging the blade that would have decapitated him had he been any slower, before sending a hasty kick towards his opponent. It didn't even slow Ringo down, though, and so he found himself faced with another sword slash half a second later that he blocked just barely with a quickly drawn kunai. Kakashi had no time to ponder on the widening of Ringo's grin as a sudden bolt of electricity discharged from her swords, passed through his kunai, and finally hit his body. Then, in a small puff of smoke, his body was replaced by a block of wood. Suten, Mizurappa. Water release, wild water wave. There was no surprise on her face when Ringo turned around and threw another charge of lightning towards the water technique that shot out from Kakashi's mouth. This time far from being caught off guard himself, however, he simply twisted his body and threw the liquid like a whip before stopping the process of infusing the technique with more chakra and consequently breaking the water's connection with his body. As a result, his opponent suddenly found herself faced with an incoming wall of water that had been charged with her own electricity. Ringo let out a deafening scream as the attack hit her, but the sound quickly died away as her body was enveloped by the waters. There was an almost eerie silence afterwards as the fight came to a halt, during which Kakashi cautiously moved towards where his opponent's body should be. The emphasis was on should be, for all he found was more water. Raiten, Jian. Lightning release, false darkness. He didn't even bother to turn around when he felt the buildup of chakra behind him and instead fell to his knees while forming hand seals of his own. Doton, Doriyuki. Earth Release, Earth-style wall. Kakashi knew that using an Earth technique to defend against a lightning-style attack would be mostly useless, but in this case, its main purpose wasn't to block him from his opponent's attack but her gaze. Just as he had hoped for, he could finish his second set of hand seals before the lightning bolt broke through the wall, shortly followed by Ringo herself. He dodged the lightning by a hair and managed to duck under the sword slash, but he instantly found himself on the defense once more as he let himself be pushed further back with every second. Not that he could have done much to begin with. Not only couldn't he outright block her weapons with his kunai out of fear of being hit by lightning and thus was forced to merely redirect or dodge them, but the wound on his chest also still hurt and constantly sapped his energy reserves. While he had hit some pressure points to lessen the bleeding just like he had learned in the Umbu, Kakashi was pretty sure he would still bleed out if he couldn't do at least some basic treatment within the next 15 minutes. You shouldn't get distracted while fighting someone like me. Kakashi was pulled back into the present by a powerful kick to his chest that sent bolts of pain through his body while knocking the breath out of him. There was no time to pity himself, though, as Ringo chose that moment to throw one of her swords at him. He managed to avoid it at the last possible moment, fortunately ending with only a small cut on his cheek rather than half a missing head. However, his last-second evasion meant that he was now in an unbalanced stance that made it impossible for him to prevent Ringo from closing the distance between them and thrusting her one remaining sword right through his lungs. Ringo gave a self-satisfied smirk and was just about to say a few parting words when Kakashi's body dissolved into water. What the dash? Before she could finish her sentence and even before the water from his dissolved clone hit the ground, the earth cracked beneath her feet and the real Kakashi emerged with a kunai in one hand. Ringo, her eyes wide with shock, instinctively tried to jump away, but she was too slow to completely avoid the attack and ended up with a wound that cut her open from her left knee all the way up to her navel. Ignoring the way his body screamed in pain at the strain of his movements while also blending out the almost deafening rush of blood in his ears, Kakashi pushed forward and continued with his attacks now that it was finally he who had the advantage. Still surprised by the sudden turn of events and slowed down by the injury to her leg, Ringo could do nothing but clumsily back away while focusing on defending herself from his most lethal attacks only, resulting in dozens of small cuts appearing all over her body. Then she stumbled and fell to the ground. Kakashi, not someone to look a gift horse in the mouth, immediately rushed forward to finish the job, only to jump into the air instead when his instincts screamed at him to get away from there. Unfortunately, that didn't help him avoid the sword that flew at him from behind entirely, resulting in a deep gash at his left hip. When he landed back on the ground a few moments later, Kakashi couldn't keep on his feet and fell to his knees. Ringo was in a similar position a dozen meters in front of him, at least, obviously in no condition to immediately exploit his weakened condition. "You are as impressive as I thought you would be," Ringo said, and although her breath was now noticeably more labored than to begin of their fight, her face still adorned a wide grin. "I think I'm a bit disappointed anyway, though. I expected a little more variety in your techniques, you see. I'm pretty sure I used more techniques than you, so I don't think you have any ground to stand on with such complaints." She chuckled. "Ah, but it isn't me who is famous for supposedly having copied over 1,000 techniques, is it? After all the stories I've heard, I thought I would come face to face with an endless number of different attacks. Instead, all I see are clones, a mud wall, and a basic water technique. Where are all your copied jutsu, I wonder?" She ripped a piece of fabric from her top and began to bind it around her wound as she spoke, and while Kakashi would have liked to stop her from doing so, he decided that it was more productive to use the lapse in their fight to treat his own wounds as well. "Just throwing techniques around for the sake of variety would be foolish," he replied after a few seconds. "The advantage of knowing so many techniques is that it allows me to choose the one that is best suited for any given situation. I wouldn't be here right now if I always wasted my chakra on random attacks without a care in the world regardless of whether they make sense or not." Oddly enough, Ringo looked disappointed by that answer. "And here I looked forward to a challenge," she sighed, her grin fading for once. "How dull." Kakashi narrowed his eyes. "That's a rather dismissive attitude for someone who barely avoided defeat just a minute ago." "Whether it was close or not doesn't matter," she said while her lips curved upwards again. "The important thing is that I did survive it. Furthermore, wouldn't you agree that you came out of this bout worse than I did?" There was unfortunately something true about that claim. While the injury to her leg would slow her down and thus theoretically give him more opportunities to connect an attack as a result, his own injuries slowed him down as well, so the advantage was basically non-existent. In fact, considering his injuries were worse than hers, it was really he who was in an unfavorable position. Kakashi had at best 10 more minutes before he would lose his consciousness from blood loss. "I'm still wondering about that," he finally said. "I don't see a clone in that direction, so how did your sword suddenly come back to you?" Kakashi actually didn't expect an answer to that, of course. Not that he needed one in the first place, as he had a pretty good idea anyway. However, Ringo unexpectedly seemed to think about it for a few seconds before shrugging and explaining it to him. "It's one of my sword's special abilities," she said with a fond look that he thought wouldn't be out of place on the face of a mother talking about her child. "I can control them from afar even without touching them. As you found out for yourself, that's a great way to catch an opponent by surprise." Ringo then chuckled. "I guess the fact that you survived not only one but 2 of my surprise attacks means that there must be a grain of truth to the stories I heard about you. Swords that can be controlled by one's mind, huh?" he thought, having his suspicion confirmed. That could actually become a problem. One of the most effective ways to win against a swordsman was to separate them from their weapon, so if she could just summon them back to her, this strategy wouldn't work on her. "I guess I need to think of something else." "Well then," Ringo said as she slowly stood up. "Shall we continue? You're not dying already, are you? The fun part has just begun." Suppressing a groan at the resulting pain, he followed suit. Zabuza was thankful that Jinan had chosen this rather spacious underground arena for their fight. Had he been forced to confront the man in the comparable narrow corridors, he might have had more of a problem swinging his gigantic sword. Here, however, there were no such troubles, allowing him to fight to his heart's content. "You should have tried to assassinate me again instead of fighting me heads-on," he shouted while swinging Kubikari Basho in a wide arc towards Jinan's head. "Not that you would have succeeded, of course, but at least you wouldn't die quite as quickly." Jinan ducked below his attack and retaliated with a powerful blow from Kabutori's hammer, flying past Zabuza's face close enough for him to feel a breeze before making the floor crack when it hit the ground. "Killing you without you even realizing it wouldn't be satisfying at all. I want to watch the despair in your eyes when I crush your bones and the fear when I finally cut off your head." Zabuza laughed while deflecting the following axe strike to his stomach with not a thought. "Big words for someone who could barely even cut me at all during our last fight. Considering all you managed to do was to destroy a mere clone of mine, I don't think you have any ground to stand on." He wanted to give a snide reply in exchange, but an uncomfortably close attack cut him off. Deciding that the time for talking was over, Zabuza began to concentrate on the fight in earnest. He waited for the perfect moment to strike as he momentarily allowed himself to be pushed back while dodging most attacks and deflecting those he couldn't avoid to lull Jinan into a false sense of security until he saw his chance. The next time his opponent brought down his hammer with admittedly frightening force, Zabuza held Kubikari Basho up with one hand on each end and blocked it. The power behind the attack almost made his knees buckle and shot painful tremors down his arms while his shoulder groaned under the pressure, but he stubbornly held his ground. Then, with an angry scream, he pushed back, throwing a surprised Jinan several meters backwards. Caught off guard as he was, Jinan could barely dodge Zabuza's follow-up attack. While both of them were much more comfortable in the offense than in the defense, Zabuza could at least effectively use his weapon as a shield of sorts. Jinan, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Both his fighting style and his weapon were ideal for swift and powerful attacks, but they offered little in terms of defensive abilities. That became obvious less than a minute into Zabuza's attacks as Jinan was forced more and more to take blunt hits in favor of avoiding Kubikari Basho's edge. He crossed his weapons above his head to block Zabuza's strike only to get kicked in the stomach, took an elbow to the face in favor of deflected an attack that would have cut him in half, and was reduced to swinging his axe in a hurried, uncoordinated manner just to give himself some more space to breathe. "What were you saying about crushing my bones and cutting off my head, Jinan?" he laughed when one of his attacks finally drew blood. "Maybe you should just surrender. I promise to make your death quick if you do." The wound on his opponent's hip was small, but just the fact that he had been wounded at all was a great victory. After all, the party that was injured first often experience a loss of morale, while the exact opposite was true for the one whose attack had succeeded. Jinan grunted with an angry expression on his face, but instead of replying, he did something unexpected. He jumped away from him. Now, for all that defense was an undesirable position for Jinan, Zabuza knew the man long enough to be confident when he said that he didn't let that weakness make him run away from an opponent, and especially not another swordsman. Jinan didn't even like to use the silent killing technique more than absolutely necessary, damn it. Making such a move was completely out of character for him and thus made Zabuza's alarm bells ring. It was thanks to that he didn't immediately follow after him, giving him enough time to react and jump away when Jinan began to make a hand seal. A second later, the ground between the two of them exploded. So he prepared our fighting ground in advance, he thought with a huff as he watched the stirred up dirt and dust in front of him with keen eyes, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's not his usual style, but I really shouldn't be surprised. In the end, he had always been a coward. The sudden buildup of chakra on the other side of the dirt cloud made his eyes go wide. It was the only warning he got before the maw of a dragon made from water broke through the dust. Sutin, Suiari Yudan no Jutsu. Water release, water dragon bullet technique. Zabuza was jumping backwards and forming hand seals even before the dragon's head had entirely left the cloud. Sutin, Sujin Hiki. Water release, water formation wall. As there was no already existing water source close by, he was forced to use his own chakra to create some. And while that was technically not a problem in and of itself, it was unfortunately a little bit slower than it would have been otherwise, meaning his shield wasn't nearly as strong as he would have preferred it to be when the water dragon crashed into it. The technique softened the impact, but it still made him groan in pain when his shield was broken and his opponent's attack blew him through the arena. He first flew through the air and then skidded across the ground before finally coming to a halt in a crouched position at the other end of the room, leaning on his sword. There was no way he would let go of his weapon even if he was hit by an opponent's technique for support. There was not much time for him to gather himself, though, as he was forced to block an axe slash from the suddenly appearing Jinan a moment later, leaving him wide open for Jinan's follow-up attack to Zabuza's chest. He was sure that his ribcage would have been shattered hadn't he managed to get his left arm between the hammer and his chest just in time. However, even the fact that he avoided a lethal wound didn't distract him from the seething pain that shot through his arm when probably every bone in it broke in the same instant. Suro no Jutsu. Water prison technique. Zabuza's head spun around, his sight somewhat fuzzy from the onslaught of pain, while his eyes widened in surprise at the appearance of a second Jinan, but he was unable to do anything to stop the sphere of unnatural heavy water from forming around him. Kyubikaribisho fell clattering to the ground to his right a second before he was completely enveloped by the water. How the mighty have fallen, Jinan said with a nasty drawl as he stepped closer to him. You seemed so confident just a minute ago, but look at you now. He laughed. Say, wasn't this one of your favorite techniques? You always enjoyed the hopelessness in your opponent's eyes after you captured them, didn't you? I never understood that, to be honest, but I think I can see the appeal now. Zabuza sent him a glare instead of foolishly attempting to speak and consequently wasting precious oxygen, but Jinan clearly understood what he was thinking. Now don't look at me like this, old friend. You can't blame me for fighting dirty, can you? If anything, you should feel honored that I was forced to resort to something like this instead of killing you the good old-fashioned way. In hindsight, it had truly been naive of him to overlook the possibility of Jinan doing something like this. Furthermore, such short-sightedness was completely out of character for him. The only explanation Zabuza could come up with for his behavior was that he must have been blinded by his eagerness to kill his former colleague. Fortunately, he still had an ace up his sleeve just for situations like this. You know, Jinan continued, completely unaware of Zabuza's thoughts. I never liked you. I'm sure that doesn't come as much of a surprise, of course. All of us hated each other to some degree. However, in my opinion, you were the most irksome of us all. A little poser kid who thinks too highly of themselves, that's what you are. Did you really think that murdering your classmates made you in any way special? Don't make me laugh. I always wanted to kill you, and now I finally have the chance to do just that. He couldn't suppress a snort at that stupid monologue, not even caring about the wasted breath. What had Jinan done to deserve his spot in their group? Zabuza had sweat and bled to be where he was today, while Jinan had merely been chosen as Kabutori's successor by its previous owner, or so he claimed. For all they knew, that could have been a bald-faced lie. The only reason nobody complained was that he was actually somewhat talented in the weapons usage. Also, look at where the both of them were now. While Jinan was a wanted criminal with no place to call home and no true agenda to keep him going, Zabuza was the last member of the 7 swordsmen of the Mist still loyal to Kirigakure and one of the Godame Mizukage's closest confidants. So, who was the true poser kid between them, huh? There was no way a single snort could give all of these thoughts away, but going by the furious expression on his face, Jinan got the gist of it anyway. "You still think you're better than me, don't you?" he growled. "Well, let me prove you wrong, you bastard." Zabuza waited until Jinan was almost upon him, his axe raised to cut him apart while he was sitting seemingly helpless in the water sphere, before he made a single hand seal. The explosion tags he had hidden beneath the bandages around Kubikuraibisho's hilt exploded. The explosion immediately ripped the water prison apart, destroyed Jinan's water clone, and threw the original away all at once. Jinan managed to regain his composure a few seconds later, but by then, it was too late to do anything but widen his eyes at the sight of the huge sword flying towards him before it pierced his chest and swept him along its trajectory until it embedded both of them in the wall at the far end of the arena, pinning Jinan against it a meter above the ground. Zabuza limped slowly towards his former colleague, who was trying to speak only to fail due to the blood that quelled from his mouth. "Please don't be angry at me for fighting dirty," he said with an exhausted chuckle. "To use your own words, you should be honored that I resorted to such measures to beat you." While the water prison had actually protected him from the explosion for the most part, it had been impossible to get away from it completely unharmed. Considering its strength, however, he should probably count himself lucky that all he got were some mediocre burns on his right arm and leg. It was rather annoying that both his arms were now as impaired as they were, though. Jinan tried to speak again, but it ended in just another chortle. Furthermore, he was visibly growing weaker by the second. "Spare you energy, old friend," Zabuza continued. "For someone in your current position, every second is very, very precious. Also, I didn't go through the annoyance of getting hit by my own attack to see you die so soon. I want to watch you struggle, watch you try to get out of this only to realize that it is impossible." He sent Jinan a nasty grin, revealing his sharpened teeth now that the bandages around his face had been burnt off. "You were right, you see. I do enjoy the hopelessness in my opponent's eyes when they realize that their death is inevitable." Jinan tried to retort once more, but he barely managed to open his mouth while the light in his eyes steadily grew weaker. "You see, your greatest mistake was to not kill me when you had the chance. You should have known by now to only play with your prey when there is absolutely no way for it to break free." He chuckled. "I would tell you to take an example from me, but alas, it's unlikely that you have enough time left to take advantage of this lesson." There was still anger in Jinan's brown eyes as he glared at him, but that quickly transformed into fear and ultimately desperation as he grew weaker and weaker. Then, he finally closed his eyes for the last time, deprived of the opportunity to say some last words by the blood that filled his lungs. "Idiot," he muttered as he pulled Kubikuraibisho out of the wall with a grunt, uncaring of Jinan's lifeless body that fell to the ground as a result. "If you want to gloat, make at least sure that your enemy is already dying." Most fights between shinobi of roughly the same strength usually lasted for a comparatively long time, but other than that, most confrontations ended rather quickly. However, there was a surprising number of shinobi who acted like Jinan and got overconfident as soon as things progressed even a little bit in their favor, which then regularly cut their lives short when their opponents used this lapse in judgment against them. For all the disdain he felt towards Jinan, the man should seriously have known better. "Who's the poser now, bastard?" With these words and the knowledge that there was no one close by to observe his moment of weakness, he collapsed to the ground with a heavy breath. Chapter 38, Swordsman of the Mist 8. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 8. While Ringo's injuries fortunately slowed her down enough for Kakashi to keep pace, he knew it wouldn't stay like this for too long. They might be more or less evenly matched for now, but with how much worse his state was than hers, his strength would leave him long before hers did. In fact, Kakashi could already feel his limbs growing numb while he grew more lightheaded by the minute. Yes, he definitively needed to do something soon if he wanted to not only win but also survive this confrontation. Unfortunately, it wasn't exactly easy to come up with a plan when some crazy woman continued to relentlessly rush and swing swords at you. It was good that he already had something in mind, then. "Kmen, Kakashi Hatake," she screamed in glee when he dodged another slash that would have decapitated him on the spot. "Stop running away and face me." Not bothering to reply, he instead reached into his pouch and pulled out a kunai with an explosion tag. Not deterred by that in the slightest, Ringo merely laughed before throwing herself at him again. However, her expression quickly changed when instead of preparing himself to block or back further away, he jumped straight at her. She had no time to do more than let out a surprised gasp before they both were enveloped in an explosion as the tag that was still in his hand went off. Her figure jumped out of the resulting dust cloud a few moments later, an angry snarl on her face as she glanced at the light burns on her right arm. "So now you're trying to be sneaky, Hatake?" she asked into thin air. "Stop fooling around and come out. I don't know when you switched with a clone, but dash." Before Ringo could finish, Kakashi jumped at her from behind. However, having evidently expected such an attack, she jerked around with one smooth step and rammed one of her swords through his chest. His body transformed into hardened earth almost immediately, keeping her sword locked in place. Ringo's eyes widened. A rock clone. Then, the clone exploded. When she came out of the dust cloud this time, there weren't any new injuries to be seen. However, that had never been the real intention of his attacks. The fact that they had successfully achieved their true purpose became clear once one realized that Ringo currently carried only one sword. She opened her mouth again only to find herself under attack before she had the chance to utter as much as a single word. "Suten, Suiari Udan no Jutsu. Water Release, Water Dragon Bullet Technique." It looked for a moment as if Ringo would use a lightning technique to defend herself again, but then she remembered what happened the last time she did that and instead jumped away to avoid getting hit by the huge water dragon that crashed into the ground where she stood just a moment earlier with a loud explosion. Even after dodging that attack, she had still been close enough for the resulting shockwave to knock her back, making her bounce across the ground several times before finally coming to a stop in a crouch with several new small cuts to show for it. Ringo cautiously looked around and waited for another attack to follow the last one, but when nothing happened for several seconds, she slowly rose back up to her feet while analyzing the new battleground, because the previous water technique had not only ripped through many trees to get to her but also uprooted several more when it crashed into the ground. She now stood in the middle of a small clearing, allowing her to observe her surrounding unhindered by any obstacles. Deciding that she was safe for now, Ringo held her free hand out as if to grab something from thin air. However, nothing happened. She scoffed. "So that was your plan," she called out, probably guessing that he would be close enough to hear her. "You went through all this trouble just to part me from one of my swords." She laughed. "Weren't you saying something about not wasting chakra by stupidly throwing techniques around just a minute ago?" Kakashi's response to that was to push his hands through the earth surface from beneath her, grab her ankles, and pull her into the ground until only her head stuck out before emerging in front of her. "It's not wasted if it gets you right where I want you." Even when he was saying that, Kakashi mentally prepared himself for what would surely happen any moment now. After all, even if his Sharingan hadn't caught Ringo's hand seals earlier, the smug expression on her face would have been more than enough to give away that something wasn't quite right. He was proven right a second later when her body vanished in a puddle of water that sank into the ground. Raito Jutsu, Rakurai. Thunder Swords Technique, Thunderbolt. A stream of lightning shot into the air from a few dozen meters to his left, making him inwardly sigh even when he was simultaneously waving hand seals of his own. "Only once, I would like to be wrong about such a thing." His own water technique had flooded the surrounding area with liquid, making it the perfect target for a lightning technique as it would conduct the electricity everywhere and consequently hit him no matter where he tried to escape to. Well, at least that was what he wanted Ringo to believe. After all, Kakashi wouldn't have used his chakra in such a wasteful manner if all it did was give his opponent such a perfect target. Suten Dan, Orika. Water Release Bullet, Orca. All the liquid in the area instantly shot into the air and formed a ceiling of sorts that absorbed the incoming lightning and protected Kakashi from the deadly attack before beginning to crash through the trees towards where he had seen the lightning come from just a few short moments earlier. Knowing that he hadn't had much time left, he ignored the exhaustion he felt from using most of his remaining chakra and immediately rushed after it. It took him scarcely 5 seconds to find her, just in time to see the protective water dome around her that she must have used to block his attack vanish, and thus giving him the perfect opportunity to take her by surprise. Ringo clumsily took a step back to avoid having her throat cut by his kunai, her face for once spotting an angry grimace instead of the giddy grin it had before when she reflexively brought her remaining sword up in an upward slash. Sidestepping that, Kakashi closed in on her in an attempt to limit her movement and consequently the usage of her weapon before ramming his knee into her stomach. She gasped in pain but still had the presence of mind to catch his wrist with the kunai before he could stab her. However, this meant that she couldn't back further away for the moment and thus allowed Kakashi to do what he had planned to from the beginning. Using the brief respite of their fight, he grabbed her shoulder with his free hand and used it to push himself over her while also keeping a hold on her wrist in his hand, resulting in him landing behind her back half a second later while Ringo stumbled due to the unexpected move. He then let go of her, not caring that he lost his kunai in the process, before throwing his leg out in a roundhouse kick. Eyes wide, Ringo jerked back to avoid the attack only to gasp in surprise when it went way past her head and instead connected with her hand that still clutched her single remaining sword. The weapon immediately flew out of her hand, vanishing in the distance. While certainly surprised by that, his opponent reacted quickly and used the short time when he was more focused on her weapon than on her to jump back and race through hand seals, well aware that she wouldn't have enough time to summon her weapon back before he was on her again. Raiden, Jian. Lightning release, false darkness. Unfortunately for her, this was exactly the reaction Kakashi had been hoping for. Not hesitating in the slightest, he jumped forward, ready to face the attack head-on. To attack as silent relief, there wasn't anything special on the other side of that door. Just another corridor with even more doors on each side. With how it was connected to that operation theater, he had expected the worst. However, there were 3 things that stood out. First, the doors here weren't the same wooden constructs he had seen in the rest of the complex so far but strong, heavy-looking metal frames. Second, this was the first corridor that showed signs of destruction without actually having collapsed completely in that it missed nearly a third of the wall on the right side while debris piled up on the floor in front of the hole. Third, there was a strange sensation in the air. It almost felt like chakra, but not quite. It was also somewhat familiar, though Ataka couldn't put where he had felt it before. The only thing he knew for sure was that there was something sinister to it, something dark, and that he had to be wary of it. That conclusion was confirmed a second later when a figure slowly crawled out of the hole in the wall. He actually needed half a second to recognize it as a human. Or, well, as something that had certainly been a human at some point. With how deformed and distorted the figure's body appeared to be now, it was hard to say if that term could really still be used to describe it. Crawling on all fours, the woman, for that's what the figure was, slowly looked around before her gaze landed on Ataki, revealing golden eyes in midst of a black sclera. 2 curled horns like those of a ram emerged from her head that otherwise only spotted a few batches of blonde hair that once must have been bright and shining but now was nothing but a dirty mess. Her body, clad only in some torn gowns that did little to cover her body, was littered with scars and black blood stains while at least half of her visible skin had a brown coloring and scaly appearance. Only her arms retained most of their natural look, but even that ended once one glanced at her hands and spotted the claws that looked like they could cut steel. Her legs, on the other hand, were by far the worst. They didn't resemble anything human anymore, consisting of only scaly, leathery skin and deep cuts that Ataka thought went all the way to her bones. Other than that, what first caught one's eyes were the 2 big bulges on her back that were almost the same size as her head. If all of this wouldn't have been enough to make Ataki realize what he was dealing with, the black, flame-like markings that spread out all over her body from her throat would have given it away. This is one of Orochimaru's hideouts, he realized. That means. However, before he could finish the thought, the figure let out a loud, inhuman howl before suddenly jumping straight at him, the force of it shattering the ground below her. There were over 30 meters between them, but even with his Sharingan predicting her movements, he was almost too slow to dodge. Even then, he felt a breeze hit his face when the claws slashed through the air in front of him, and he could smell the rotten stench of decay that hung around the figure like a cloak. Not disheartened by that miss at all, his opponent let out another shrill howl before jumping after him when he tried to retreat further back. She's fast, he thought while raising his arms to perform a jutsu. Faster than Kushimaru, even. However, as long as she doesn't catch me by surprise, I should be able to evade her. As if to prove him wrong, it was then that steam-like chakra shot out from a hole in her elbow, propelling her arm forward and consequently transforming an attack he would have been able to dodge into one impossible to avoid. All he could do was to use his already raised arms to block the incoming fist. While that indeed softened the blow, it didn't mean that the impact wasn't devastating. Although Itachi was by no means weak and had even reinforced his arms with chakra, the blow not only knocked all the air from his lungs but also immediately catapulted him backwards, making him cross the entirety of the corridor in less than a second, crash through the wall back into the operation theater, and then continue to fly until he finally came to a stop when he slammed against the wall at the other end of the room. However, even such a blow didn't stop him from keeping an eye on his opponent. After all, one of the most important rules for a shinobi was to be aware of what your enemy was doing at all times if somehow possible. No matter how much pain a shinobi was in, they needed to stay alert if they didn't want to be surprised by a fatal attack. It was this mentality that allowed him to spot the female figure jumping after him through the hole in the wall the very moment it came out of the dust cloud. This, combined with the facts she was obviously not capable of rational thinking and looking straight into his eyes, meant that he could cast a genjutsu on her while she was still far away. The recoil of his illusion being broken happened almost at the exact same time he cast it. In fact, it happened so fast that Itachi didn't think the technique had even taken hold of her mind in the first place. He didn't need long to understand why. A genjutsu worked by controlling the chakra flow of a target's cerebral nervous system, meaning a disorderly and erratic chakra network would make it impossible for illusions to work. That was usually not a problem, of course, as such a network would make it impossible for a person to cast any sort of technique or even mold chakra effectively at all. It was just too bad that his current opponent wasn't a regular person but the result of human experiments. It seems I can't depend on genjutsu in this fight. Even with the recoil of his failed technique, he still managed to duck under the punch that destroyed the wall behind him without too much trouble before he jumped back into the now open corridor while weaving hand seals. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire release, great fireball technique. As he had predicted, the figure continued to rush straight at him, meaning that his attack would probably have connected even if he hadn't fled into the narrow corridor where dodging such a big technique would have been impossible anyway. Going by the high-pitched screams, he assumed the attack had been a full success. Unfortunately, just when he thought that, the figure jumped out of the flames, the burns that marked her skin her normal one, not the scaly parts not even slowing it down. Itachi once again couldn't do anything but raise his arms to soften the blow before he was thrown backwards by the force of the punch and consider himself lucky that at least she hadn't slashed at him with her claws instead. It was fortunate that the corridor they were in now was much longer than the previous one, meaning there weren't any walls for him to crash through. Instead, Itachi flew through the air for a bit until his feet touched the ground again, making him slid over the floor some more before he finally came to a stop. Still, he thought with a short glance at his throbbing arms. From now on, I should avoid her punches rather than try to block them. He wasn't sure what would happen if his arms took 2 or 3 more of these punches, and he didn't plan on finding out. Redirecting and dodging it is, then. Itachi was forced to put these plans into reality a second later when his opponent appeared in front of him, claws extended and ready to cut him into pieces. Letting himself fall backwards, he dodged the crude attack with a flick-flack during which he used his upwards swinging legs to kick both her arms into the air, leaving her entire body open for attack. Then, not waiting for her to recover, he drew a kunai and tried to pierce her heart, intending to end this fight in an instant. The emphasis was on tried, however. Itachi hadn't much time to be surprised by the fact that his weapon couldn't pierce her skin before his opponent brought both her arms down in an attempt to crush him into the ground, forcing him to abandon his position and jump aside before twisting his body to connect a roundhouse kick with her head to throw her backwards and buy himself some more time. His attack might have failed, but this short confrontation hadn't been completely useless. The modifications are definitive results of Orochimaru's curse mark, but it's still quite different from Sasuke's version. Aside from the obvious fact that Sasuke had been in complete control until Orochimaru took over his body instead of being basically a mindless beast, the chakra of his current opponent felt completely different from his brother's during their fight. There was simply something primal and vicious about hers that he had lacked. It's probably safe to assume that this is an earlier and less successful version. However, that doesn't explain why she has more raw power than Sasuke. If anything, it should be the other way around. As much as he would like to look more into this mystery, and as much as he knew that this could very well prove useful in future confrontations with the Rogue Sannin, there just wasn't any time for any of that right now. If his suspicion was true, Orochimaru was much closer than he was comfortable with, considering they already had 2 of the 7 swordsmen as opponents. He would prefer to meet up with his team now instead of potentially facing 2 enemies of such caliber at once all by himself. Consequently, he would need to take care of his current opponent quickly. Preferable without wasting any more chakra than absolutely necessary. He pitied the poor girl, and that was what she was. While all the deformations made it impossible to tell her exact age, he didn't think she was all that much older than 15 or 16. It was not her fault that she fell into the Sannin's clutches, but he couldn't let that stop him. It was at least a small relief that a quick death would probably be a mercy at this point. Itachi was pulled back into the present by another high-pitched howl, spurring him on to fly through hand seals before his incoming opponent could reach him. A second later, his body was torn into 2 pieces when her claws went straight through his torso. His body devolved into a murder of crows just a heartbeat later. The disfigured girl shrieked in surprise and began to lash out at the birds around her, trying to swap them away with clumsy and uncoordinated slashes of her claws, not too different to how a small child would swing their hands at a bee. That was exactly what Itachi had hoped for, though, as he wanted her to be distracted for the moment. While his crows continued to swarm around her to block her sai and keep her attention away from him, Itachi quickly drew several shuriken with attached steel wire. That wasn't the most notable thing, however. What truly mattered were the explosion tags that were fastened to it in periodic intervals. Itachi had always been talented with shurikenjutsu, and he hadn't slacked off in this life either. The weapons barely touched his hands before he threw them, letting them fly great arcs through the air before colliding with each other and changing their trajectory to reach whatever target he had in mind for them. When all was said and done, just about 3 seconds later, all of his opponent's limbs were wrapped in steel wire and explosion tags. Similarly, there were even more explosion tags now pinned to the wall and the ceiling around her as well. Were her previous shriek one of surprise, the howl she let out now expressed nothing but furious rage. Itachi wasn't foolish enough to believe that his wires would hold her for long. With how much physical strength she had already demonstrated, she could probably tear them apart with the same ease with which he could destroy grass helms. This was another reason for why he wouldn't try to capture her. The efforts he would need to put into that were too great as to be worth it. Without any further delay, he jumped as far away from his opponent as he could before making a single hand seal. A moment later, the corridor was engulfed in an explosion. Kakashi watched as Ringo coughed out some blood from where she lied to his feet. How did you dash? Another cough forced her to stop mid-sentence. How did you do that? Just speaking that much visibly exhausted her already, but he could hardly blame her. While she had somehow managed to avoid having either her heart or her lungs pierced by his attack, the hole in her torso was clearly a lethal wound. Not enough to kill someone as strong as her immediately, no, but still very much deadly. Kakashi gave her a minute or 2 at most. You were saying you heard a lot of stories about me, he reminded her while trying to get his own breathing under control. His sight was already getting blurry from blood loss and his legs felt like jelly. The last thing he needed right now was to collapse next to her and give Rango the chance to take him with her. Can't you figure it out yourself? He thought he saw a flash of confusion behind the pain-filled haze that had lied itself over her eyes before it was replaced by understanding. Why you cut through it? I did. Kakashi had concluded that if pressed without her 2 swords and with no way to run away, Ringo would naturally fall back on using a lightning technique in her defense. If he could overcome that, the odds were in his favor that he could finish her with one single strike. As it turned out, he had been correct. The copy ninja, Ringo chuckled before quickly falling into another coughing fit. And the man who cut through lightning. Should have thought of that. You should, he agreed. But I'm grateful you did not. He thought she wanted to chuckle again, but in the end, all she could muster was a bloody smile. Good fight, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Had fun. Kakashi looked at her for several more seconds even after Ringo had closed her eyes for the last time before allowing himself to collapse against a nearby tree with an exhausted sigh. This could have gone better, he muttered to himself while pushing his forehead protector back down to cover his Sharingan. Let's hope that Itachi and Zabuza had more luck than I. Right now, he would have loved nothing more than to give in to the blackness that currently tried to envelop his mind, but he couldn't let that happen. First, he needed to patch himself up somewhat to avoid bleeding out on the spot, and then he would need to look for his teammates, primarily Itachi, to see if they were alright or needed help. Only after that could he allow himself to rest. That being said, a glance down his body made him grimace. I really shouldn't have postponed attending some of Tsunade-sama's lessons until after this mission, should I? Some medical ninjutsu would have been pretty useful just about now. Preoccupied with his thoughts and the treatment of his wounds, as well as impaired by the numbness that still seized his senses, Kakashi did not notice the rumbling in the distance that grew louder and louder by the second. Chapter 39, Swordsman of the Mist 9. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 9. Itachi slowly emerged from the ground at the foot of a rocky slope, first only with his head and then ultimately with the rest of his body as well. An unfortunate side effect of him blowing up the corridor was that he had been forced to use the hiding in surface technique to escape it unharmed himself. However, considering his revelation about Orochimaru, that was an acceptable consequence. The situation had changed and so had his approach. Instead of prioritizing the search for Zabuza, he now had every intention of returning to Kakashi first. After all, Itachi had no idea where exactly the swordsman was, while his other teammates' location should be rather easy to find. He didn't want to abandon one teammate for another, but he was also realistic enough to understand that there were times where one had no other choice but to prioritize one above another. Furthermore, Kakashi's summons probably had a better chance of finding the man anyway. Itachi was just about to turn around and run in the direction he suspected Kakashi to be when an explosion not too far from him blew up the ground and threw dirt and dust into the air, creating a great cloud that limited his view on the area. Naturally, Itachi immediately jumped onto a nearby branch high above the ground to put some more distance between himself and what he figured was his clearly not so dead opponent. This assumption was confirmed a moment later when a shrill howl filled the air, the unnatural sound making his hair stand on end. Itachi pursed his lips when the dust cloud began to fade away and revealed the deformed figure of what once used to be a young woman. He wasn't one to curse, but that didn't stop him from feeling rather frustrated by the sight of her almost unharmed body. Yes, there were a few cuts and burns on what remained of her human skin, but most of her body seemed completely fine. In fact, some parts of her dark, leathery skin actually appeared to be even thicker and healthier, if that word could even be used to describe such an abnormal perversion of nature than before, making him suspect that she also possessed some sort of regenerative ability. If all these explosions and the rocks from the collapsing corridor didn't bother her, none of his standard techniques would either, and considering there were at least 2 S-rank enemies left unaccounted for, he didn't want to waste his chakra and use one of his more powerful techniques against this opponent. Maybe the best thing to do would be to flee before she notices me. That idea unfortunately flew out of the window as soon as it crossed his mind, as it was at that exact moment his body moved on its own and jumped high into the air to avoid the fist that would have smashed his head into a gory mess. A second later, his opponent jumped after him, a wild and inhuman look in her eyes. Itachi had realized earlier that outright blocking her attacks would be detrimental in the long run due to her immense strength, and as dodging wasn't easy, not that they were both in the air, all he could do in this situation was to redirect her limbs away from himself. She caught up with him fast and immediately swept at his face in a wide sideways arc with her claws, making Itachi lean back while also carefully slam his fist against her wrist to make the attack go wide. What followed was another swing with her other hand which he neutralized in the same way, followed by a third that came at Itachi from above and which he let fly by harmlessly with a simple twist of his body. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe a part of her realized that these kinds of attacks wouldn't work, but her next attack was a well-aimed punch at his chest that might actually have connected if Itachi hadn't had the Sharingan to predict her movements. Consequently, Rather than blowing a hole into his chest, Itaka twisted his body once more and grabbed onto the limb to pull himself closer to his surprised opponent before kicking off her body to not only break them up again but also propel her to the ground. That strategy seemed to work just fine at first, but before he had time to use this short window to think of a new plan, everything went wrong again. Just like when Chakra had steamed out of her arms earlier to increase the speed and power of her punch, the same happened now, the only difference being that it didn't emerge from any of her limbs but the two bulges on her back he hadn't paid much attention to until now. As a result of that, instead of continuing to fall to the ground, she suddenly shot up again, flying straight at him. Itaka managed just so to avoid her clumsy strike but couldn't do anything to stop the collision. The impact of it knocked the air out of his lungs and disoriented him for a little more than a heartbeat, but at least the latter was the case for his opponent as well, considering there wasn't any follow-up attack from her that he needed to worry about. Their bodies were tangled together for only 2 or 3 seconds before departing from each other again, giving Itaka more than enough time to collect himself and adjust his body in a way that allowed him to land softly on his feet while his opponent crashed much less gracefully into the ground, stirring up another cloud of dust in the process. Using that opportunity, he quickly created a crow clone to fight in his stead while he hid in the background to give himself some time to think. He had just positioned himself behind a thick tree when his opponent jumped out of the dust cloud again, no worse to wear by the crash that would have broken several bones in a normal human body. Not that Itaka was surprised, mind you. From his position behind the tree, Itaka observed the resulting fight between his opponent and his clone while he thought about what he should do. On one hand, this was the perfect opportunity for him to escape and find Kakashi. As long as his clone continued to fight, which would be quite a while considering it could reform even if it got destroyed until it ran out of chakra and distract the poor victim of one of Orochimaru's experiments, Itaka would be able to get away without being noticed quite easily. On the other hand, leaving a possible enemy behind didn't sit well with him. He had enough experience to know that such things came back to bite you, and having to deal with her on top of Orochimaru if they truly encountered the Sunin would be a serious problem. Even more so when there were still the 2 rogue swordsmen to consider. Yes, it would be for the best if he took care of this right now instead of letting it become a problem later on. As strong as she might be, in the end, she was still little more than a beast. With her mind so obviously broken as it was, all her apparent power was pretty much wasted on her. After all, if you couldn't use your abilities smartly, you could just as well not have them to begin with. That being said, her durability might be a problem. Itaka really didn't want to waste much chakra on this, so he needed to find a way to kill her as efficiently as possible. The best approach would probably be to finish her off with one single, lethal attack, he thought. Judging from the way she doesn't bother much with guarding her vital spots or defense in general, piercing her heart or even decapitating her shouldn't be impossible. However, that was only true if he could actually go through her skin. He hadn't forgotten how his Kunao had failed to pierce her skin earlier. Coating his weapons with chakra could do the trick, and he thought it might be even more efficient to specifically enhance them with either wind or lightning chakra as well. Neither element was his speciality, but he could manipulate them enough to get by. Although if my attack fails and she survives, it would ultimately have been useless and a waste of both my time and chakra. She had proven to possess regenerative abilities, after all. She would most likely shrug off every non-lethal attack without a second thought, and if that happened, he would be directly in front of her. As much as he was confident that he could get away from her again without getting injured, the odds of something going wrong wasn't zero and he saw no reason to risk that. He could use long-range techniques, of course, but that brought him back to his problem of using more chakra than absolutely necessary. Just 2 or 3 wouldn't even be a problem, but the likelihood of that being enough was slim. Then, suddenly, Itaka's eyes widened when he got an idea. It was a little bit risky but not more so than his plan of coating weapons in chakra, and the kind of attack he had in mind would also conveniently bypass his opponent's ridiculous high defense. He had never actually attempted to use it outside of the classroom and even then not in a combat situation, but he knew that he could pull it off. As much as he disliked people gushing about his supposed status as a genius, he was in fact a prodigy. Mastering new techniques always came easy to him, even without the help of his Sharingan. Also, if things went perfectly, he might even be able to capture her instead of being forced to kill her. While he certainly couldn't make that a priority considering the situation, it would be rather beneficial if he could pull that off. It wasn't worth it to take unnecessary risks, of course, but if the opportunity presented itself, he would take it. It took him little more than a minute for an opportunity to present itself. His clone got hit in the chest and immediately dissolved into a murder of crows that swarmed around its opponent, giving Itaka the opening he needed to close in on them without being noticed until it was already too late. He was in front of the grotesque figure in the blink of an eye and dodged its reflexive sweep with ease before spinning around his own axis and throwing a kick up against his opponent's chin. Although it felt like kicking a wall and sent vibrations through his body that made him clench his teeth, the attack did its job in that it lifted her off the ground and thus limited her mobility. It was then that he could execute the rest of his plan. While still in midair, his opponent gave a frustrated growl as she threw out her leg to kick him away. Having hoped for just that reaction, Itaka focused his chakra into his hands and compacted it as much as he could before forming it into small, sharp blades just like he had learned in Tsunade's lessons. Her left leg flew mere millimeters over his head as he ducked beneath it, close enough for him to feel a breeze of air whirling through his hair, and he used that opportunity to gently tap her upper leg before quickly falling back again to get some distance between them. When she landed on the ground a few moments later, she let out something that sounded like a surprised squeak when the leg Itaka had just tapped immediately gave away beneath her. His clone immediately realized what he had done and rushed towards her with chakra-coated hands as well. Seeing that, their opponent howled again and lashed out with her right arm. His clone didn't care about that, however, and didn't even bother trying to dodge the attack. It managed to tap her arm less than a heartbeat before the claws tore it apart, dissolving it once more into a murder of crows. Itaka took a moment to watch them fly away and note that his chakra must have run out as the clone didn't reform again, but it didn't really matter. With 2 limbs down, his opponent's movements became even easier to predict and consequently easier to dodge. Even more so because he couldn't now identify the buildup of chakra in the bulges on her back for what it was instead of being caught by surprise as he had been previously. Chakra once again steamed out from her back and propelled her forwards, right towards Itaka's waiting form. She first roared in triumph, but that sound quickly turned into confusion when his body was replaced by a wooden log in a puff of white smoke. Then, with nothing sturdy enough to stop her momentum in her path, she continued to fly forwards in a parallel line to the rocky slope to their right, leaving a trail of destruction and uprooted trees in her wake before finally coming to a halt. Itaka was on top of her half a second later and used his chakra scalpels to immobilize her remaining 2 limbs as well. Then, just to be safe, he did the same to destroy all the nerves, muscles, and chakra pathways that led to the bulges on her back just as he had done with her limbs as well. After all, there was no need to risk her using that method again to possibly catch him off guard. The end of the fight felt almost anticlimactic. That was obviously a stupid thought, however, fights rarely had a big and dramatic climax. In fact, most fights didn't last any longer than this one had, only ever scratching the 5 minutes mark when either both opponents were very close in skill and experience or when one was stronger than their opponent and deliberately stalled the fight. Still, even as he observed the lying figure in front of him, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. However, because he couldn't pinpoint anything specific that would explain this sensation, Itaka decided to keep that in mind but for now focus on what was in front of him. His instincts were rarely wrong, so whatever was subconsciously bothering him would make itself known sooner rather than later anyway. Thus, rather than worrying about things he couldn't change, he instead observed in wonder as his fallen opponent's vile chakra slowly but surely began to repair the damage he had inflicted on her. He had cut through her pathways and injected his own chakra into it to disturb her internal system, but even that turned out to be not enough to keep her down for long. In fact, if he were to take a guess, he would say that it would take only about 10 to 15 minutes for her to be back on her feet. No wonder my earlier attacks didn't work on her, he thought. If she can heal internal wounds like that this fast even after I utilized my chakra scalpels, external wounds naturally don't pose much of a threat. It would take a truly devastating technique to overcome such a powerful healing ability. A cold shudder ran down his back when he remembered that Orochimaru also possessed almost unbelievable regenerative abilities. While it didn't come as much of a surprise that they were at least partially the result of experiments instead of merely an advantage gained from a forbidden technique, this was the first time he had confirmation of that. Just thinking about how many innocents must have landed on his operation table, how many must have died slow and painful deaths to reach this point, made him sick. It also made him wonder which other abilities the Sunin gained this way he didn't know about, or how the fact that he had left Konoha earlier in this timeline had affected things. Itaka forcefully discarded these grim thoughts. There was nothing he could do about any of that right now, and he needed to find Kakashi as soon as possible so that they could go after Zabuza together. There was no time to waste with useless thoughts. Unfortunately, due to her healing abilities, it was impossible to take his opponent prisoner. Things might be different if there were no other enemies left to worry about, but alas, that was not the case. Hopefully examining her corpse would be enough to find out why her cure mark abilities were so much stronger than those he had observed in Sasuke. He felt sorry for that young woman, the victim of crimes that went against nature itself, but it couldn't be helped. This was hardly the first time he killed someone that didn't deserve their fate, and it was unlikely to be the last time either, but at least it could be considered mercy in this case. After what she had gone through, death would surely be a welcome reprise. Itaka could confidentially say that there was no pain or suffering in the afterlife, after all. Decision made, he once again channeled chakra into his hands, intent of giving her a quick and painless death. He felt the ominous presence a moment before its owner made itself known. Kukyuku, would you look at that? It appears even my creations are no match for the great Uchiha clan. There, standing on top of the rocky slope and looking down on him with a nasty grin on his face, was Orochimaru. Kakashi was just about to gather his strength and stand up after finally having his wounds patched up enough to at least avoid bleeding out on the spot when a distant rumbling caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be the result of a nearby fight, but he quickly realized that not only did it come from the wrong direction but also was a constant sound that got louder and louder while closing in on his approximate position. Then he noticed the column of smoke rising up in the distance and vanishing into the horizon beyond what he could see, confirming that it was indeed someone or something approaching instead of the result of some technique. Is it too much to ask that this is backup? Itaki had sent a crow back to Konoha when their promised support from Kiri hadn't arrived at the agreed meeting place, after all. Unfortunately, considering their distance from their home, it was highly unlikely that any possible backup would already be here. Sure, some random patrol that was close enough to the border to react quickly might have gotten the message first and came to help them, but what were the odds of that? Kakashi was rarely so lucky. That also wouldn't explain why their arrival was accompanied by such a ruckus. This is better not another enemy, he thought with a sigh even while he prepared for the worst. We have enough on our hands as it is. The last thing we need is another opponent. Itaki had hoped to reunite with at least Kakashi if not his entire team before possibly encountering the Rogue Sunin, but it appeared that wasn't to be. Facing him alone like this was truly the worst-case scenario, but now that it had happened, Itaki had no other choice but to deal with it. However, it wasn't only Orochimaru that caught his eyes but also the motionless figure at his feet. Oh! Orochimaru said, his grin impossibly growing even wider. Are you wondering about that ugly thing? It's nothing worth mentioning, really. Just something that got in my way that I got rid of. With that, he gave the body a hard kick that made it thunder down the slope. A few seconds later, Kushimaru's lifeless body came crashing to the ground just a dozen meters away from him, and a quick glance with his Sharingan confirmed that it was indeed the real deal and not just a convincing fake body. After all, there was no way to fake the fading chakra signature his eyes could clearly make out. Or at least there shouldn't be a way, he conceded in the privacy of his mind. Who knew what kinds of tricks he had come up with over the years? Itaka still didn't think it was a fake, but it was better to be safe than to be sorry. Orochimaru, he finally greeted the man with a calm demeanor while his head came up with undecorated idea after idea about how to deal with this situation. Can I assume you didn't come to turn yourself in? The Sunin chuckled. Oh my, who would have thought a member of such a prestigious, stuck-up clan as yours would make a joke in such a situation? Maybe I need to revise my opinion of your lot after all. If it's not that, then is it merely to insult my family? As amusing as that might be, I'm afraid that isn't the reason either. Orochimaru slowly licked his lips. No, rather, I long since thought about which ability I would like to acquire next, and the Sharingan is always on top of the list. He then threw his arms out in a dramatic fashion that made Itachi momentarily focus on the familiar ring on his left pinky before continuing in a noticeably excited tone. How could I possibly resist when none other than the famed Itachi Uchiha went through all this trouble just to come to me all by himself? He wasn't surprised by that admission at all. While he had expected the man to try luring him to his side first, there had been no doubt in his mind about his true intentions. It was a shame, though, as playing along with such a scheme would have given him a better shot at taking him out. Not that this turn of events was surprising either, mind you. Orochimaru had always been an arrogant individual, regularly to the point where it came to bite him later on, and he probably thought that prodigy or not, he could take Itachi by force without too much trouble. Itachi was confident that he could take him, however. Even more so because they hadn't fought in this timeline yet. In his last life, Orochimaru had once tried to take his body by force as well, and just like now, he had been rather overconfident in that confrontation. Once he thought himself in a superior situation, he let his guard down and allowed Itachi to not only free himself but paralyze the man with the genjutsu of his in turn. He was confident that he could have beaten the Sun in a straight fight as well, but it wouldn't have been easy nor even a guaranteed victory at all. Without taking him by surprise as he had done, he would have been forced to use some of his most dangerous techniques, and with the man's tendency to somehow always escape when things get tough, there was still the possibility that he would have gotten away before Itachi would have had the chance to finish him off for good. What he was getting at was that after that first confrontation, every future fight against this opponent would have been much harder. This was an entirely new timeline, though. Here, the two of them never crossed blades with each other, meaning Orochimaru wasn't as cautious of him yet as he was in Itachi's previous life. This, in turn, meant he could still be taken by surprise. Although no matter how confident he might be, Orochimaru was unfortunately still clever enough to avoid looking directly into his eyes. Doing so wouldn't be just arrogant but positively stupid, after all. Still, Itachi wouldn't let that stop him. In fact, Orochimaru probably believed that every genjutsu not cast directly through his Sharingan would be useless and thus didn't expect any such technique to be of any danger to him. Itachi could use that against him. After all, whatever illusion he used only needed to paralyze him for about a second, if even that. As long as that happened, he could finish this with one attack. He didn't plan to give his opponent the chance to recover and either fight back or flee. Well then, Orochimaru continued. Why don't we dash? Itachi didn't wait for him to finish before casting his strongest genjutsu that didn't require eye contact on the man without as much as a single hand seal, making the Sun freeze on the spot. A moment later, he appeared in the air next to him, his eyes spinning and transforming into the Mangekyo Sharingan. Orochimaru might have amazing regenerative abilities that allowed him to come back from almost any injury, but even he would be finished if pierced by the Totsuka blade and pulled into its eternal realm of drunken stupor. However, before he had the chance to even form his Susanoo, a figure that had previously been out of sight and hidden beneath Orochimaru's chakra that blanketed the area jumped towards him with a kick to his chest. Itachi managed to raise his arms in time to block the attack. The power behind it wasn't particularly strong. He didn't feel any pain in his arms even though they were still battered from his previous fight or overwhelming, but because he was still in midair, there was nothing he could do to stop himself from being thrown back towards where he came from. He felt the backlash of his genjutsu being broken even before his feet touched the ground. This is bad, he thought. With that attack having failed, any fight that broke out from here would undoubtedly be a hard one, especially if the newcomer proved himself to be even just a somewhat decent opponent as well. I can't have him intervene whenever I'm about to beat Orochimaru, so taking him out first will take priority. That was quite rude, wasn't it? The Sunin said, his surprise at being caught off guard like that already forgotten. Hasn't anyone told you not to attack someone in the middle of a conversation? Things would have turned ugly if not for Nakamura's timely interference. The brown-haired young man bowed in acknowledgement before turning his gaze back towards Itachi, his eyes hidden behind a pair of glasses. While he had never met that person before, he recognized that name from Anko's and Yukio's stories easily enough. So that's their teammate that went with Orochimaru, then. Now that I think about it, Orochimaru continued with a contemplative expression on his face. You took his place on my former team, did you not? In a way, that makes all three of us part of the same lineage, doesn't it? How unfortunate that the other two aren't with you. Now that would have been an interesting reunion. I'm sure they wouldn't be quite as happy about it as you." The other man shrugged. "It's only my opinion that matters, so why should I care about what they think? It's exactly that mentality that will ultimately result in your defeat." Orochimaru only laughed. "Is that so? Well, I guess we will see about that soon enough." While he still made sure to avoid his gaze, Itaka could see the glee in his yellow eyes clear as day. "You know, when I made this little arrangement with these two swordsmen about offering them shelter in this hideout in return for them bringing me new subject to experiment on, I never dreamed that one of them would be the bearer of a Mangekyo Sharingan. I'd love to know how you awakened it when the last thing I heard was that Shisui Uchiha was its sole user." When Itaka stayed silent, Orochimaru simply shrugged again, apparently having expected that reaction. "No matter. You will tell me all your secrets soon enough anyway." Itaka didn't plan to let it come to that. He might have preferred to fight the Sunin under different circumstances, and having two opponents was far from ideal as well, but in the end, he was still confident that he could do it. Especially because he was more than just a little motivated to do so. After all, Orochimaru had taken an interest in his brother before, and there was no way to be sure he wouldn't do so again. If the Sunin died here and now, however, that danger would be taken care of before it could become an actual problem. "In my experience, those that talk big usually fall on their faces shortly after." Orochimaru chuckled, not intimidated in the slightest. "Aren't you doing the exact same thing just now, Itaka-kun?" "Possibly, but I'm not the one that already needed to be rescued once because they got caught off guard." While he would never admit it out loud, Itaka felt a surge of satisfaction when he saw the arrogant smirk on Orochimaru's face momentarily turn into an annoyed scowl before he caught himself and forced his face back into a confident expression. Neither of them said another word, but there was a noticeable shift in the air around them as both prepared for a fight. The weight of each other's full attention set upon their shoulders, killing intent filled the area, and leaves rustled while cracks appeared in nearby stones under the pressure of their combined chakra. Muscles tense, Itaka was just about to jump into action when a loud rumbling reached his ears. Then, before he could attempt to identify its source, a gigantic blue snake broke through the trees a dozen meters to his right. However, as much as that sight shocked him, it wasn't as much the snake that caught his attention but the person riding on its head. She had grown over the years, of course, and the dark violet dress that reached down her legs and the red sash around her waist were new to him as well, but he would recognize that person everywhere. "Well," Anko said, her playful tone belying the hard look in her eyes. "Seems like I got here just in time for a dramatic entrance, didn't I?" Chapter 40, Swordsman of the Mist X. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist X. Anko knew that 6 years was a long time, but it still caught her off guard when Itaka appeared next to her on Aida's head and she saw just how much he had changed since she last saw him. Gone was the weena little 7 years old she had said goodbye to when she left Konoha to go on her journey, replaced by the teenager she saw now. However, no matter how much he might have changed, she instantly realized he was still very much the Itaka she remembered. Sure, the lines on his face were deeper than a few years ago. He now wore a Jonin uniform instead of his simple back top and beige pants, and he was taller than before, but the look in his eyes, weird Sharingan muster aside, hadn't changed one bit. Although she wouldn't admit it out loud, Anko was glad that he wasn't quite as tall as she yet. The idea of him towering over her instead of the other way around annoyed her more than she would like to admit. Someone who hadn't changed in all that time she hadn't seen him, on the other hand, was Orochimaru. Anko felt the anger in the pit of her stomach stir at the sight of him and only grow stronger by the presence of her former teammate at his side, but she swallowed it down. Now wasn't the time to let her emotions get the better of her. Besides, there was something else she needed to take care of first before she could devote herself to taking care of the two traitors in front of her. It wasn't easy, but after waiting for several years already, she could be patient for a few more minutes. "Anko, what are you doing here?" Although it didn't show on his face aside from a slight widening of his eyes, the genuine surprise in Itaka's voice made her grin. Weren't the situation so grim right now, she would thoroughly enjoy the rare occasion of having caught him completely by surprise. "Well," she drawled, just a little bit smug. "A helpful little snake told me that a certain Sunin was causing trouble in this area, so I thought I'd give it a look." I didn't expect to run into any old friends, though. So you decided to seek out Orochimaru the first chance you got without telling anyone. You could at least try to act a little bit more thankful that I'm here now to save your ass, you know. Contrary to her words, her grin grew only wider. Of course the first thing he would do was reprimanding her. I am thankful for your aid, but that doesn't make your decision any less reckless. Anko rolled her eyes in an extravagant manner to not only express her thoughts on that matter but also to subtly check the area for more enemies. It's not like I planned to actually confront him once I found him. She then tilted her head in mock consideration. You know, now that I think about it, the only reason I do so now is that you were obviously in trouble, so one could claim that me being here right now is your fault. To be fair, when she first got her lead onto her former sensei, she did plan to fight and kill him. However, once her emotions had cooled down somewhat, she realized what a terrible idea that was. As much as she had improved over the last 6 years, she wasn't arrogant enough to believe she could take him on by herself quite yet. Still, that didn't mean she couldn't find out his location, bring the information back to Konoha, and then join the team that would doubtlessly send to deal with him, right? Never would she have expected to find a team already present, even less so one that included her teammate. Itaki opened his mouth to reply but was cut short by the silky voice of Orochimaru. Well, if that isn't Anko-chan. What a nice surprise. I just mentioned how sad it is that the rest of our lineage wasn't here. Say, you didn't happen to bring Yukio as well, did you? Although they had been talking, both she and Itaki had kept most of their attention on him in case he used the opportunity to attack them. After all, if he attacked them with the expectation of catching them by surprise, they might turn the table on him instead. No matter how small this advantage might be, it was still better than nothing and they needed to take whatever edge they could get their hands on. The knowledge that the two of them could still silently communicate and agree on a plan like this even now sent a surge of elation through her veins before she concentrated back on their current situation and sent a glare right at the Sunin. Unfortunately, I did not, she said, her voice dark. I'm sure he will be disappointed when he hears that we took care of you without him. Orochimaru chuckled, but it was Nakamura who replied. It seems you're still as arrogant as ever, Anko, he said while adjusting his glasses. You can't possibly think the two of you will be enough to beat not only Orochimaru-sama but me as well, can you? To be honest, I didn't really consider you as enough of a threat to include you in any of my thoughts. It's not like your presence will change anything about the outcome, after all. While Anko presented a tough appearance, inwardly she didn't know what to feel. She had always hoped that Nakamura didn't run away with Orochimaru willingly, that he had been kidnapped and pulled along without his consent, so him being so openly antagonistic now felt like a slap to her face while also making her feel both angry and sad. On the other hand, a part of her was relieved that he wasn't just another victim of their sensei's crimes. At least this way, things were straightforward, he was their enemy and needed to be treated as such, nothing more and nothing less. Nakamura took an angry step towards the edge of the slope. If you think you're still stronger than I am, you're wrong. I trained a lot and became much more powerful than you could ever imagine, Anko said with an intentionally terrible imitation of his voice. Is that what you're going to say? Because if it is, don't bother. You Don't let her rile you up, Nakamura, Orochimaru interrupted him, the hard look in his eyes belying the softness of his voice. I don't have any use of you if you're distracted. He sent one more heated look her way before visibly collecting himself. Yes, Orochimaru-sama. The Sunin nodded with a satisfied smirk on his face before turning his gaze back towards them. Now that this is settled, why don't we discuss your terms of surrender? Now it was she who took an angry step forward, but before she could get very far, Itaki's hand on her shoulder stopped her. Don't do anything rash, Anko. I know that. She was aware that she acted without thinking sometimes, but the White Snake Sage had made very sure to beat some patience into her head. I'm not stupid enough to fall for such an obvious trick. Anko thought he would fight her on that, but to her surprise, he took one look into her eyes before releasing her shoulder. It seems the last 6 years have been good to you. Much to her embarrassment, she felt herself flush at that. Hey, what are you saying? You're not Tanaka-sensei, so stop acting. The whistling sound of a thrown weapon made her stop mid-sentence and turn around to catch the kunai before it could hit her head, coincidentally distracting her enough to let the short darkening in Itake's eyes at the mention of their sensei go unnoticed. "Oh, are you feeling impatient now, sensei?" Orochimaru's face had turned from a mostly amused smirk to a more annoyed expression. "You know me too well, Anko-chan. I just don't like being ignored." She smirked a bit at that, but instead of replying to him, she once again turned towards her teammate while keeping the sun in at the edge of her sight. "Itake," she said. "I found Kakashi on my way here. He has been injured and needs medical care. I did some first aid, but I don't know any healing techniques and didn't have the means to do more than that." He obviously understood what she was implying immediately. "You want to fight them on their own. Only until you got him fixed up." While saying that, she used her body to hide her right hand while secretly flashing him the hand signs for distraction, regroup, and retreat. "I would prefer it if you could hurry with that, though. It would look bad on your resume if you only got back here after I already beat them up. Maybe the two of them could actually win this fight, but the odds weren't exactly in their favor. Especially considering Itake had clearly already exhausted about a third of his chakra and suffered at least some minor injuries if the way he held his arms were anything to go by. No, as much as she hated to admit it, now wasn't the right time to take care of her traitorous former teammates. However, Kakashi's condition needed to be addressed sooner rather than later. His injuries weren't life-threatening but still very bad. According to him, Itake knew some medical ninjutsu, so the best course of action right now was for him to fix Kakashi up enough so that he wouldn't be a burden and then find a way to flee from here. They didn't have much time to discuss, so it was fortunate that Itake only needed a second or two to come to a decision. "I trust that you can survive until I get back here." It was formulated as a statement, but she heard the underlining concern for what it was. "Of course I can," she said with her best confident grin. "I didn't spend the last 6 years just sitting idly and twiddling my thumbs, you know." There was no need for any more words between them. Trusting her decision, Itake nodded before vanishing in a shunshin. Curiously, the deformed body that laid on the ground a few meters to Aida's right vanished a second later as well. Anko returned her full attention back towards the two men on the slope above while also beginning to make the necessary preparations for the fight to come, making note specifically of Orochimaru's confident smile. "Oh," she said, raising a single eyebrow. "Not gonna run after him? I don't remember you being someone who let their prey escape." Unfortunately, rather than being riled up by her words, he only appeared amused. "You Konohana are so very predictable. You're always trying to play the hero and save your teammates. As long as you're here, Anko-chan, I don't need to worry about him getting away." His grin then widened to a degree that made even her uncomfortable. "Trust me, my dear. At the end of the day, his eyes will be mine." "Yeah," she thought. "I don't think so. However," Orochimaru continued, "I agree that it's somewhat bothersome that he took my test subject with him." He turned his head. "Nakamura." His back immediately straightened under his master's attention. "I understand," he said. "I will take care of that immediately. Hey, what dash?" Without as much as a glance at her, he rushed into the direction Itake had vanished earlier. Anko wanted to jump after him or at least follow him with her eyes, but she didn't dare to move around. Even just turning her head was no option. It was dangerous enough to just speak while doing what she was doing, any more than that, however, and failure would be guaranteed. "Oh?" Orochimaru asked in a mocking imitation of her voice. "Are you not going to run after him? I didn't think you would allow either of us to escape our righteous punishment at your hands." She scoffed. "I can just as well go after him once I took care of you." "Is that so?" he chuckled. "Then let us hope that your comrades will still be alive by then. You should know better than to think he can beat any of them, sensei." Surprisingly, he agreed. "Fair enough, but as long as he stops them from doing anything to that girl, his death won't be meaningless. Everything else is secondary." Anko actually felt bad for Nakamura after hearing Orochimaru dismiss his life so easily, but then she remembered that he, too, was a traitor and discarded that stupid sentiment. "What's so special about her anyway?" she asked. "Don't you have enough prisoners to torture?" He tilted his head and adopted an expression of sorrow that was so fake that it made Anko grit her teeth. I do, of course, but not all of them provide such magnificent results as she does. It's also important to get out as much information as possible from those subjects that survive the initial procedure, you see, and with how little time this one has left, it's all the more essential to get her back and continue my research before it's too late. Her eyes narrowed, but Orochimaru continued before she could do as much as open her mouth, apparently predicting her question. The human body is host to so much energy, Anko-chan. Energy that rests patiently in every cell of our bodies, content with being inactive until it's needed to keep us alive instead of being available at our beck and call. And once it runs out, we die. His face momentarily deterred into one of disgust before returning to its default state. Wouldn't you agree that this is such a waste? Every day, countless people's lives are cut short long before they can fully exploit the full extent of their bodies, and even those that are still alive can't reach their full potential as long as they can't access what lies hidden in their cells. Just imagine what humans could do with that kind of power. The realization of what he had done made her blood run cold. You transformed her life force into chakra. Isn't it amazing? A civilian girl with no talent to become a shinobi managed to gain the power to face the much celebrated prodigy of the Uchiha and not only stay alive but actually push him back for a time. He chuckled in a mixture of amusement over her disgust and glee over his successful experiment. The exchange ratio is not yet as effective as it could be, and the unfortunate side effect of losing one's mind is regrettable, but such things can be solved with time. Now, finding a way to stop the life force from continuously escaping once the metaphorical plug has been taken out on the other hand. Anko knew what crimes Orochimaru had been accused of, knew of his cruel and vile experiments on innocents and even babes he had carried out, but there was a difference between theoretically knowing about such things and listening to him talking about them, similar to how you would talk about an academy assignment. To listen to him now, knowing that she could have continued to study under him for who knew how long had things gone just a little bit different, made her sick. Not only that, but it also made her furious. She knew better than to let her emotions control her actions these days, but damn it, was it tempting to just let her anger take over. "Hey, Aida," she said, her bland voice standing in vivid contrast to the turmoil she felt on the inside. "I'm ready. Please don't do anything stupid, Anko-sama." It was clear to her that he wasn't any less worried than he had been when she first convinced him to tell her what was wrong with him, but at least he understood that now wasn't the time for long arguments. She was thankful for that. "Of course not, idiot. And what did I tell you about not calling me Sama?" Aida hissed in what was the equivalent of a nervous chuckle for a human. "I will stop to do so if you survive this confrontation, Anko-sama." She gave him a vicious grin, knowing that he could hear it in her voice even if he couldn't see it. "Deal. Are you quite done?" Orochimaru spoke up, his arms crossed and his mouth curved up in a mocking smirk. "For your sake, I hope whatever plan you have come up with will be worth it. I would hate to have been as patient as I was only to be disappointed." His grin gained an edge to it. "And you know how much I hate to be disappointed. Don't worry, sensei. I promise this will blow your mind." On her unspoken command, Aida vanished in a gigantic puff of white smoke that instantly swallowed her in it, hiding her from Orochimaru's eyes. Katon, Karyuin Dan. Fire release, Fire Dragon Flame Bullet. Barely a second after she had vanished in the smoke, a high-pressure stream of fire shot out from it that quickly formed the body of a long, serpentine dragon while its flames became white in color as its heat increased. The attack smashed right through the ground where he stood, melting earth and stone alike as everything in its path was destroyed in the blink of an eye. A powerful technique indeed, but useless all the same if it doesn't actually hit its target. Orochimaru, however, had evaded it by simply jumping high into the air. The smug grin on his face didn't waver as he observed the destruction her technique had brought, and at first, that didn't change even when she suddenly appeared behind him, but the moment he turned around and caught sight of her, his smirk faltered and his eyes widened in surprise. "You dash." His reaction was understandable. After all, her appearance would catch almost everyone by surprise, especially when one knew what it meant. With two small horns growing from each side of her head, parts of her skin becoming more scale-like, dark markings forming around her eyes that had black veins twisting away from them, and green chakra flicking in and out of existence around her, She certainly made quite the curious sight. Also, in her personal opinion, she looked pretty badass. Sure, her fingernails growing sharper and more claw-like kinda sucked, but other than that, this form was pretty amazing. However, the thing that she thought probably threw Orochimaru off the most was the fact that her eyes were now exact matches of his. Most of these changes would cease to exist once her mastery over the natural chakra increased, but for now, they were to stay, and Anko wasn't too mad about that. After all, they were proof that she had indeed learned how to use Sage Mode. Furthermore, they had just proven their worth by catching her opponent off guard enough to allow her to break through his guard and connect a kick with his chest before he could raise his arms in defense, catapulting him straight to the ground where his impact caused a loud explosion that stirred up dirt and rock and created a big crater. Anko wasn't done yet, though. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire release, Great Fireball Technique. An orb of flames much bigger than anything she could have ever imagined producing a few years ago crashed into her former sensei's motionless body barely a second after he had crashed to the ground, instantaneously filling the area with the smell of burned flesh. Anko wasn't fooled by that, however, as her increased sensory abilities warned her about the presence moving through the underground, meaning she was well prepared when the ground broke open and Orochimaru emerged, his lower body replaced by that of a snake and his mouth unnaturally wide open. A second later, a snake shot out from it that then opened its maw as well to summon a sword that aimed right at her. Instead of foolishly trying to dodge it when she was still midair, she instead twisted around and caught the weapon between the soles of her feet before putting all her power into throwing it back towards the ground, the force behind that move pulling first the snake and then Orochimaru himself with it. By the time her feet touched the ground, Orochimaru had already used his own brand of substitution technique and stood once more on his own two legs, no worse to wear from their previous bout. The only change from before was that now, his face spotted an excited and probably more importantly downright greedy expression. Sage Mode, he muttered barely loud enough for Anko to hear before raising his voice to address her directly. Never would I have imagined that you were strong enough to master that technique. Had I known you held such potential, I would have taken you with me when I left the village. Anko didn't have any time to waste considering she could keep this up for only 7 minutes at a time, so she pushed off the ground. Then I will count myself fortunate that you didn't. She reached him in an instant and threw a fist at his face that he blocked almost absent-mindedly before bringing his knee upwards to knock the wind out of her. However, instead of just letting that happen, Anko jumped into the air and twisted with no regard to the arm that was still in Orochimaru's grip, catching him by surprise once more when her arm twisted with her as if there were no bones in it. The kick she then followed up with while still in midair missed his head but forced him to let go of her fist and back away a bit. Oh, but think of all the strength you could have gained had you continued to study under my tutelage. Not wanting to give him time to rest, she rushed after him before smoothly falling into a crouch and trying to sweep his legs away. He simply dodged that by taking another step back before bringing a heel down to where her head would have been had she not jumped away just in time, smashing the ground into pieces. I only grew this strong because you left, and because I came into contact with people I would have never met had I stayed your student. It was he who rushed at her and threw a punch to her head this time. Anko didn't catch it like he did before, however, and instead redirected it to the side before sending a roundhouse kick to his chest that he blocked by crossing his arms in front of him. Then it was his turn to throw a kick at her, but she evaded it by ducking under it and breaking into his guard that way, only for him to avoid her follow-up punch by flipping over her and landing behind her back where he immediately avoided her mule kick with a mere tilt of his head. Then maybe you should join me now and combine what you have learned so far with what I have to offer. Jumping around in one fluid motion, she aimed a slash with the edge of her hand at his throat that he redirected away from himself with a simple slap. Unfortunately, that unbalanced her enough to make it impossible to dodge his following kick to her chest, forcing her to raise her other arm to block it. He had evidently not put too much power into that attack, though, allowing Anko to stop herself from being pushed away more than a meter or so, but the force behind her still made her teeth clench. You have nothing to offer that I could be interested in. Maybe I should just bring you with me without your consent, then. When he rushed at her this time, he was notably faster than before, and it were only her enhanced senses and instincts rather than any conscious decision that made her duck her head under his fist and back away from the blow of his elbow. However, there wasn't anything she could do when he grabbed the hem of her top and threw her away, making her bounce off the ground several times before finally coming to a stop on all fours with several scratches to show for it. Orochimaru was already rushing at her again when she looked up, one arm raised in preparation for some kind of technique. Desperate to not allow him to take control over their fight, she did the first thing that came to her mind. Sen'i Jashu. Hidden Shadow Snake Hands. Sen'i Jashu. Hidden Shadow Snake Hands. 8 white snakes shot out from his sleeves and headed straight for her, mirroring the 3 that shot from hers. One couldn't be blamed for thinking that she was at a disadvantage because of these numbers alone, but there was one glaring difference. While Orochimaru's snakes were normal specimen aside from their color, hers were constructs of pure, poisonous green chakra. Consequently, when the 2 techniques met, her snakes tore through his like a knife through butter before moving on to pierce right through Orochimaru's chest. A second later, his body dissolved into mud. She jumped around a moment before he spoke up again from where he stood a dozen meters away from her. I never quite understood the pride many teachers take in the successes of their students, he said, his breathing calm and no hair out of place. However, watching you now, I can't help but think that I get it now. At least to some degree, that is. Don't try to take credit for my achievements when the only thing you have contributed to them was running away with your tail between your legs. Yes, he chuckled, completely ignoring the second part of her reply. If someone deserves credit, then it's the White Snake Sage. You did well in seeking her out and convincing her to teach you. Sage mode is a powerful asset, after all. Anko snorted. Is that jealousy I hear in your voice, sensei? It must be frustrating to have searched for Ryokai Cave for ages only to find that you're unable to master its technique because of all the changes you made to your body that you were oh so proud of. For all that these modifications doubtlessly made him stronger, they were at its core a perversion of nature. It was only logical that such a body wouldn't be able to use a technique that required the molding of natural chakra as Sage Mode did. Unfortunately, rather than being angered by her comment like she hoped he would, Orochimaru just shrugged. A temporary setback, I guarantee you. Nothing that can't be overcome with time. Well, too bad that your time is up, then. The respite had been short, but it was enough for her to regain her breath and come up with another plan now that the straightforward approach had proven to be ineffective. With that in mind, she quickly formed 3 hand seals. Senpo, Hakyuji no Jutsu. Sage Art, White Rage Technique. Anko took one deep breath before expelling a red dragon-like entity with an orb in its front claws that rushed towards Orochimaru, who didn't waste any time and retreated backwards. However, that quickly proved useless when the dragon didn't actually follow him but coiled around itself and released both a blinding light and a deafening sound that made the air in the area oscillate. One advantage of her current form was that she could close her cornea and thus negate the effect of the bright light, but that was something she suspected her opponent could do as well. What he most definitively couldn't do, on the other hand, was coating her body in a protective layer of natural energy that at least partially protected her from the vibrations in the air. Together with the earplugs she had made specifically for this technique, Anko was as well protected from the effects of her own technique as humanly possible. The same couldn't be said for Orochimaru. While even the lesser effect the vibrations had on her body were extremely painful and made her feel as if she was walking through quicksand when she moved, she at least still could move. He, however, was very much paralyzed, and judging from the combination of pain and surprise on his face, he hadn't expected anything like that to happen at all. Ignoring the agony that shot through her veins with every yet so small movement she did, Anko rushed towards him and drove a fist into his stomach with enough power to make him gasp. Not stopping there, she then sent him flying into the air with a kick to his chin before jumping after him and continuing to rain blows down on him while he was defenseless. One could think that it would be smarter to try cutting off his head or something like that, but that assumption would be wrong. Anko knew of his ability to just shrug off most if not any physical damage and thus didn't even try such an approach. With that logic, dealing blunt trauma didn't appear any smarter, but that was only the case when one ignored a very important detail. She didn't just hit him but also tried to infuse natural chakra into her fists and insert it into his body with every punch. That wasn't a technique she had mastered yet, but she hoped that even the less than stellar result of her attempt would be enough if she hit him often enough. After all, just like with poison, there was a certain amount from which on even a relatively harmless substance became absolutely lethal. Unfortunately, it was just when she began to think that maybe she could actually win this fight when Orochimaru somehow twisted out of the way of one of her punches, grabbed her, rotated them both until it was he who was on top and her who was with her back to the ground, and sent her downwards with a kick to her chest that knocked all the air out of her lungs. That effect was intensified tenfold when she crashed into the hard earth and every part of her body cried out in pain. She didn't even feel it when her own technique stopped, the new pain that replaced its effect on her being too omnipresent in her mind to notice. Still, even when every fiber in her body protested, she fought herself back to her feet in just about 5 seconds without even intentionally thinking about it, her instincts telling her that staying down would mean certain death. Her blurry sight immediately fell upon Orochimaru, who watched her from a safe distance with an appraising look in his eyes, quickly followed by the empty hole that lied next to him on the ground, indicating that he had used his substitution technique once more. Interestingly enough, there were still some light bruises to be seen on his skin that should have healed immediately when he shed his skin. They were already healing, of course, and doing so quickly, but the fact alone that they were still there at all meant that her technique had done something. Now if she could just master it completely, she might actually stand a chance. That was quite the interesting technique. I never had the chance to study sage art attacks, so I'm thankful for the opportunity to observe them firsthand. Anko scowled, ignoring the taste of blood in her mouth. Just how had he escaped her attack? Her eyes widened when her eyes fell on the empty hole again and noticed the trails of blood trickling from its ears. No way, she thought. Don't tell me. Did you direct your chakra into your ears to burst your eardrums? He gave her a smile that almost appeared to be proud of all things. Well deducted, Anko-chan. I'm glad to see that it's not only your fighting prowess that has improved but your mind as well. She ignored him, however. Such a simple trick and yet so effective. Of all the ways I imagined that technique could be countered, that wasn't one of them. In fact, she had come up with not much at all. The White Rage technique had seemed like one of these overpowered jutsu that were almost unbeatable to her when she first learned about it. To have it beaten the very first time she used it was honestly rather disheartening. What was worse, she now had only a little bit more than 2 minutes left during which she could use Sage Mode. If she couldn't create an opening to flee in that time, this would be it for her. Anko had no time to continue that line of thinking because her instincts suddenly screamed for her to move, and when her brain caught up with her body a second later, she found herself crouching flat on the ground after having just dodged Orochimaru's slash with a sword that he got from somewhere. You shouldn't get distracted during a fight, he purred. That was one of the first things I taught you, remember? Not bothering with a reply, Anko tried to use the opportunity to throw another chakra-coated fist into his stomach only to find herself thrown into the air when he brought up his knee and connected it with her chin. Before she could even fully understand what had happened, another kick made her fly away until she came to an abrupt stop against a tree. She barely avoided the blade that would have decapitated her but was helpless against the sweep of his leg that sent her flying once more. This time, she managed to twist herself while still in midair and land on her feet, which then allowed her to jump into the air and flash through hand seals a second before her opponent's heel crashed into the ground where she stood mere moments ago. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire Release, Great Fireball Technique. The fireball had barely engulfed Orochimaru before he broke straight through it and appeared right in front of her, the only sign that he had just jumped through flames being the melted skin on his face that she knew would be gone the next time he substituted himself. All she could do was to raise her arms to lessen the blow when he sent her back to the ground with another kick. He was just playing with me, Anko realized grimly while he continued to throw her around as he pleased. He could have ended this fight the entire time and only didn't do it because he was curious about what I can do. Even now he's not taking me seriously at all. She had known that he was stronger than her, of course. She had held no illusions about that fact. However, she now understood that the gap between them was much larger than she could have ever predicted. If she wanted to come out of this alive, she needed to act now, and she needed to do it in a way he didn't expect. The next time he stabbed at her with his sword, she didn't try to avoid it completely and instead pushed it aside while staying where she was, ignoring the burning pain when it cut her at her hip. Furthermore, she then jumped straight at him without even bothering to do anything against the fist that slammed into her stomach. While the force behind it almost made her throw up, she willed through it and kept her concentration. After all, She hadn't gone through all of that to get close to him only to waste the opportunity because of a little pain. Sen'i Jashu. Hidden Shadow Snake Hands. Two snakes made of chakra emerged from her sleeves and immediately tried to wrap around Orochimaru, and while he barely managed to avoid that, he was momentarily forced to back away. That, on the other hand, allowed her to form hand seals freely. Senpo, Muki Tensei. Sage Art, Inorganic Reincarnation. That wasn't an easy technique, nor was it one that Anko had fully mastered yet, but she could use it relatively reliable as long as she didn't move around and concentrated on it entirely. Natural chakra filled the area while she breathed life into the ground, and a second later, it rose up and began following Orochimaru around while moving more like a liquid than actual earth. His only mildly surprised expression quickly changed into genuine shock when more and more earth began to come alive and tried to catch him. Anko couldn't fault him for that. The way that this technique allowed her to control her environment was strange and unique, manipulating the elements beyond what was considered advanced for even ninjutsu experts. It was probably this unexpected extent of her ability that managed to surprise Orochimaru enough to capture him in a ball of hardened earth several meters above the ground. She wasn't done yet, however. Let's see how you dodge this, sensei. Anko summoned every last bit of natural energy left to her as she rushed through hand seals one last time. Senpo, Orochiya Kazuchi. Sage Art, Great Snake Lightning. Lightning wasn't a chakra nature she was very proficient in, but she had painstakingly practiced this one technique for ages to access as much of its potential as she could. Consequently, when two cyan lightning-shaped snakes shot from her arms, they were gigantic in size and destroyed everything in its path with laughable ease. The explosion that engulfed the ball Orochimaru was imprisoned in was a sight to behold, and Anko actually forgot to run away for a few seconds as she watched it from afar. However, she caught herself quickly and instantly turned around to run away. Her legs felt like jelly and the exhaustion that came after losing the energy that Sage Mode provided made every step feel like an ordeal, but she couldn't let that stop her. As much as she would like to believe her attack had killed Orochimaru, she wasn't foolish enough to truly think so or even wait and find out. Hopefully it was at least enough to give me plenty of time to get away, though. That had been her strongest offensive technique, so it should have done at least some damage, right? Now I need to catch up with Itaki and his team before getting away from here as fast as possible. As if in reaction to these thoughts, a head suddenly burst out of the ground a few meters ahead of her. Anko couldn't do anything but widen her eyes before Orochimaru sank his teeth into her neck. Cursed seals. At some point, Orochimaru discovered that the body of one of his subjects has an innate ability to passively absorb natural energy. Furthermore, it apparently also secretes special bodily fluids that react to contact with senjutsu chakra, causing immediate physical alternations with further controlled shape-shifting quality to the user's body, along with greatly enhanced physical capabilities. See Itaka's report of his confrontation with one of Orochimaru's test subjects for more information. By isolating an enzyme from that subject's special fluids and mixing it with his own senjutsu chakra, Orochimaru created a set of cursed seals he can brand others with. One is the Cursed Seal of Earth, which seems to be the variant Itaka's opponent had been burdened with. While strengthening its carrier's body and increasing their chakra immensely, it seems to have much stronger side effects than its counterpart. See attached list of observed side effects and weaknesses for reference, most notably the continuous decrease of life energy that ultimately and unavoidably results in death. The other Juinjutsu, the one I have been branded with, is the Cursed Seal of Heaven. Fortunately, this one lacks the aforementioned loss of life energy, meaning I don't run danger of dying anytime soon. However, some of my tests seem to indicate that there is the possibility of it being in some way connected to Orochimaru himself. See attached test results for reference. Apart from the pain and temporary inability to mold chakra in the immediate aftermath of my confrontation with Orochimaru, there seem to be no other side effects to this seal, but only further tests will show whether this is actually true or not. It's impossible to say with absolute certainty why he created these seals, but my understanding of Orochimaru's character and the results of the primary tests make me believe that. Excerpt from Anko Madarashi's first monthly report to the Hokage regarding the ongoing research into Orochimaru's Juninjutsu. Check the description for the links to the author.